There we go.
All right, here we go.
Are we good, Brandon? I think we're good. Hey, welcome everybody. So sorry for the little glitch at the beginning, but of course, that's just the days we're in right now. My name is Jamie Longo from the chapel, and we are just so thankful that you decided to join us here tonight. You know, the discussion that we're going to have is a conversation that I believe would be important to have at any time. But I think it's specifically important considering the days that we are in, and who knows the days that we have ahead. So excited. Pastor Dave is here. How are you tonight, Dave?
I'm doing great. Really happy to be here, and really happy about what we're about to do here tonight. I wanted to kind of start with a 1-minute story. Years ago, a friend of mine recognized that drinking had gotten the upper hand in his life. And the way he realized it, he didn't hit rock bottom, didn't get a DWI, didn't lose his job or his marriage, but he had started keeping little bottles inside his desk drawer. And before he would drive home at night, he would just take a few drinks just to take the edge off, and then he would drive home. He had a couple of close calls driving, and that just got his attention. So he surrounded himself with some help. He reached out for some people who loved him and who knew what they were doing. And I remember talking to him maybe about 6 months later, and I said, "How's your life different now?" And I'll never forget what he said. He said, "When I am with my wife, when I'm with my kids, when I'm with my grandkids," he's a little bit of an older guy, "when I'm out for an evening with friends, for the first time in years, I'm fully present. Like I'm just there. I'm not numbing myself. I'm experiencing everything." And he said, "I would never trade this for anything in the world." And I loved that. It was such a compelling vision to me of just the beauty of sobriety. So earlier this year, Seth Haynes came out with his second book, The Book of Waking Up. And when I picked it up and started reading it, I thought, that's what my friend did. He woke up to life as it was meant to be lived. And it was just such a great connection. And so I'm just so excited to have Seth here tonight to lead this seminar. If you're part of the chapel family, you know he was with us this morning, preaching in our morning services. And now we get a little more time for him to teach and interact with all of us. And so let me just tell you how the night's going to go. Seth's going to be doing some teaching and explaining for about 20-minute segments, and then he's going to pause and he's going to respond to the questions that have come in. And so if you are with us tonight on the chapel online campus, you can use the chat feature to enter questions. If you're with us on YouTube or Facebook Live, you can use the comments to enter in questions on that. And then, so Seth's going to pause and he's going to respond to those questions, and he's just going to kind of go back to some teaching and then respond to some more questions. And we'll just see how the evening unfolds. So really looking forward to this. As you said, Jamie, so needed. And so let me just ask for God's blessing, and then we'll jump right in. Let's pray together. Lord, thank you so much for this moment in time that we can talk about something that really matters. We're so thankful for Seth and for his experience. Lord, for the love that he has for you and the love that he has for people. And I pray that you would use him tonight, Lord, to be a blessing. Lord, I think of people tonight who are part of this, who are really, their lives are being owned and destroyed by addiction. God, would you give them what they need and make this night a strategic part of their healing? We commit this now to you in the name of Jesus. Amen. Well, it's my pleasure tonight to turn it over to my friend, Seth Haynes. He is a practicing attorney in Little Rock, Arkansas, and he's married to the love of his life, Amber. They have 4 beautiful kids together. He's the author of 2 really great books, and we're privileged to have Seth with us tonight. So, Seth, welcome.
Yeah, so glad to be here. As Dave said, I was with you guys at the chapel, I guess a few years back. It was the first time I'd ever been to New Jersey. I have come to love New Jersey. And it felt like when Dave called and said, "Hey, could we do this again? Could we talk about this in the sort of pandemic context, addiction in the pandemic context?" It felt like a no-brainer for a couple reasons. One, I just like you guys. So there's that. Two, I happen to know just a little bit about what's been going on in New Jersey based on some projects I've been working for. And man, you guys have it rough right now. I know there are people watching from all over the place. I know there are probably some people from Arkansas, some people from other places watching. But those of you in New Jersey, it's been a rough year for you, and so I'm glad to be here with you and talk this out, talk it through with you. Typically, when I start these seminars, these sessions, I have some ground rules. And those ground rules don't really apply anymore. The reason they don't apply is because all the rules of life were in 2020 were sort of on a piece of paper. And we sort of crumpled those up and wadded them into a ball. And then we doused them in gasoline and lit them on fire. I mean, all the rules have just completely gone out the window. But typically what I say is as we start these sessions, this is a confidential space. It's a space of support, and it's a space for everyone. Now, normally we have breakouts. Normally we're face-to-face. Normally we can have dialogue and conversations back and forth. Unfortunately, that can't happen because I'm in my bedroom and you might be in yours. So what I'll say as we go about this night is that this is really meant to give you some information and really a starting place. It's meant to give you a starting place to go talk to your own system of support, which I'm just going to break this down on the front hand. That could be your spouse. If you're married, needs to be your spouse. If you're dating someone, your partner. So the people in your closest circles. It is also meant to be your therapists, your priests, your pastor, people who are in your life for spiritual direction and mental and emotional direction. So tonight, if something really sort of jumps out at you as you talk, be thinking, who are the people in my immediate circle that I can talk to about this? Who are the people in my spiritual space that I can talk to about this? And who are the people in my mental therapeutic space that I can talk to about this? Tonight, we're going to kind of go through this in 3 segments. Now, again, we're talking about addiction in a pandemic world, the pandemic world that we all live in. And so as we do that, we're going to focus on really 3 areas. We're going to focus on pain. What is the pain? What is the pain behind the pandemic? We're going to focus on addiction. What is addiction? And then we're going to focus on what is sobriety. And here's what I want you to know. Again, caveat. When we talk about addiction, I'm not necessarily talking about heroin or booze or porn or gambling or whatever are the classic addictions, sex, drugs, and rock and roll, like all the things that go along with that. It's not really what I'm talking about. It may be for you, but we're all drunk on something. And I think that as we go through the night, I'll be able to prove that both from my own research and from the writings of others, that we use all kinds of things to make ourselves drunk, to numb the pain of the world. So those things could look like a Netflix binge every night or overeating in the pandemic. I read an article today that said that there's a new phrase, we used to have the freshman 15 for college. Now they have the pandemic 15. So it could be overeating. It could be over drinking, over shopping, over watching. It could be any number of things that we use to kind of kill the pain. And as we'll talk about tonight, the question is not, are you addicted to booze or not? The question is, what is your addiction? Really? I still struggle with my own. And we can talk about that tonight. As we move into sobriety too, the question here is not going to be to drink or not to drink, to eat or not to eat, to watch Netflix or not to watch Netflix. It may be, to do a line of Coke or not to do a line of Coke. I mean, that's a pretty simple one. But some of these other addictions, it's not going to be as easy as maybe you think. The question isn't going to be to do or not to do. Instead, the question is going to be, where do we take our pain? Okay, so that's just a little bit of a foretaste of tonight. I want you to sort of prime yourselves to think about this in these ways. I want you to prime yourself to think about, as we go through, who are the people that need to know whatever you're struggling with? What is your potential struggle or addiction, even if it doesn't look like a classic addiction? And then finally, what does it mean to be sober? And that's what we're going to be talking a little bit about tonight. So as we dive in, I've never done this in 20-minute sessions before, so we're going to go super fast. If you have questions, please comment. Everyone here is monitoring, and we'll feed those my way. But we're going to fly, and because of that, I'm going to truncate my story a little bit. Okay. So I have had my own struggles with addiction in the past, and it was a classic addiction. It was booze, it was alcohol. I was telling somebody yesterday that I was so into my drinking that I had seasonal drinking disorder, perhaps. I had a gin season, which went from Easter to October 25th, which is my birthday. And then I had bourbon/whiskey season, which went from October 25th to Easter-ish. And I took this really seriously. Like, listen, no gin in the winter, no whiskey in the summer. It was a pretty serious thing for me. And the source of that for me, for years, I'd been an attorney. For years, I'd been a social drinker. For years, I probably had a functional drinking problem. But the source of that went back to one event for me. Years ago, my youngest son, who's now 9, he's with us today, was very, very ill, very sick. And we didn't know what the diagnosis was. We didn't know what he was sick with. The doctors couldn't quite figure it out. And he started losing weight, which a baby's never supposed to do. We ended up in Arkansas Children's Hospital. It was a absolutely horrendous stay in that hospital. And for a season, we thought we were going to lose him. And it was at that hospital that I decided that I did not want to feel anymore. And it was at that hospital that I called a relative and said, bring me a Nalgene bottle full of gin. And it was at that hospital that I decided, if God wasn't going to intervene and save my son, that I was going to intervene and kill my pain. Okay. It would take another year and some change to really come to understand that I was sort of killing my pain with malice aforethought, to use a lawyer term for any of you lawyers out there. I was doing this intentionally. And then it would take me even more time to really surrender that and to try to dig in and learn what was the source of my pain. And for me, the source of all of that was not necessarily my son was sick. He was, and that was a big piece of it. But as a child, I had been asthmatic, and I had prayed some of the same prayers to God that I prayed when my son was sick. God, please heal me. God, please heal me. God, please heal me. And then 30 years later, God, please heal my son. God, please heal my son. And in that space, both times, I heard nothing. I wasn't healed. My son wasn't healed, at least not immediately. And so I began to question, do I have enough faith? Is there enough God in my life? Am I good enough? Have I done enough? Is there enough? And so for me, a very certain narrative started to set in. And as I examined it, particularly in my 30s, the answer was no. No, I don't have enough faith. No, God is not big enough. No, I don't know how to connect with him. And that was the pain that really drove me, particularly as a Southern Baptist raised Christian, to really start to doubt and to really start to struggle with what did it mean to connect with God in the mystery of pain. So here's one thing that I know. In life, pain is certain. We talked about that a little bit this morning. Life does what it does. It will always bring pain. It will always hurt. And we are experiencing that right now more than ever in the middle of this pandemic. We are experiencing being locked up, being shut away, having to deal with our own pains, with our own pain points. Some of us are struggling with flagging economy and losing jobs. Some of us are struggling with our personal interactions with our wives and spouses and our children, and maybe our kids or other relationships, neighbors or whatever. As we're all sort of more homebound, we don't have places to go. We're also struggling as we're in this pandemic season because we're all locked away watching an election unfold. And that has been a nightmare. I don't care what side you're on. This has been brutal. It's been a brutal week. It's been a brutal few months. And again, the uncertainty, the chaos of American life in this election series has been very, very much present with us. It's been painful. For many of my friends, people of color, this has been an extremely difficult year as we've watched the racial tensions sort of blow up across America. And so we're in this really difficult space where we have three sort of reality altering events all coming down on us at one time. The pandemic, the racial tensions, the election, and they're all intersecting at a very critical moment in our lives that frankly, we don't really know how to handle one of these things, much less all three. Like this has never happened before in the history of America. We've never had a chaotic election, a chaotic pandemic, and a chaotic set of racial tensions, maybe one at any given time, but not all three at the same time. So what we were experiencing as a country really is pain. And I want to talk to you about that a little bit as we look at pain, the pains of our own lives. I think it's really helpful for us to begin to identify what is the shape of pain, because people express it differently, and some people can't express their pain at all. Some people don't know how to express their pain. And so as I wrote my book, which I will now shamelessly plug, if you can see it, The Book of Waking Up, I really tried to say, let me help you identify how pain manifests in your life outside of just chaos. Like, let me help you understand, let me help myself understand what pain looks like. And so in my estimation, and as I search the scriptures, I really see three forms of pain. There is the pain of scarcity, this idea that there's never enough. This was my pain point. There's never enough. I never have enough. I don't have enough faith. I don't have enough connection with God. I'm not holy enough. I'm not good enough. Maybe it's I don't have enough money. Boy, isn't that really heightened in this pandemic as we struggle with jobs. And we see that in the scriptures. I mean, Paul writes in Philippians 4 that he knows what it is to be in need, what it means to have plenty, and he's learned the secret of being content. And what he's saying is, I have this pain point in my life of scarcity, but I've learned the secret to solving that pain. The second pain is the pain of loss or grief. Now, this is a really particular pain point, I think, in your region, one of the hardest regions hit in the country. Many of you know someone or have been close to somebody who has been lost to COVID. It's a real pain. It's a real pain point, a real grief point. And you may have, even before this, lost a child. You may have lost a spouse. You may have lost a job. And that can feel for some people less like scarcity and more like loss, the death of a dream, the death of a career. We are struggling with that more than we ever had. So we have scarcity, we have loss. And again, we see this throughout the scriptures. I mean, what happens when Jesus comes face to face with the death of his friend Lazarus? He weeps. It's a real pain. The pain of loss is a real pain. And he even knew he was going to raise the dude again. But he's still crying. He's still weeping in the dust, in the dirt, because he feels the pain of loss. The third shape of pain is the pain of abuse. And if there's one thing that I know, it's that this is a really tricky one, right? Because we have different kinds of abuse. Some of you may have suffered verbal abuse, physical abuse, sexual abuse, emotional abuse. Abuse is a real, it's a real booger to kind of, as we say in the South, it's a real booger to kind of try to untangle. But some of you know the fire, the heat, the pain that comes with abuse. And again, we're seeing in this pandemic milieu higher instances, and we'll talk about this later, but higher instances of domestic abuse, of abuse taking root in American society. And finally, the fourth shape of pain that some of you will struggle with is like actual, factual, neurological pain. But here's what we know from a brain chemistry perspective. I referenced this morning a writer named Gabor Mate, and he talks about emotional pain, right? So scarcity, loss, and abuse, those are emotional pains, right? But here's what he says about emotional pain. The very same brain centers that interpret and feel physical pain also become activated during an experience of emotional rejection. On brain scans, they light up in response to social ostracism, just as they would when triggered by physical or harmful stimuli. When people speak of feeling hurt or having emotional pain, they are not being abstract or poetic, but scientifically quite precise. So here's what we know. Brain scans show when we struggle with emotional pain, it's just like being hit in the head with a hammer, cutting your finger, whatever pain that you've stubbing your toe, whatever pain you felt last. When you have emotional pains, when emotional pains crop up, your brain does exactly what it does when you actually have physical pain. And why is that? It's because pain is meant to signal to us that something is not right. Something is broken. Something needs healing. And so when you have the pain of scarcity, loss, or abuse, these emotional pains, and when your brain chemistry goes nuts and says, this hurts, just like if I cut my finger, what that's meant to do, it's a God-given signaler that something is amiss and something needs to be healed. Okay, so we see right now in the pandemic that people are struggling with this more than ever. I shared these stats. I want to share them again. 60% of adults say that the situation they're facing right now in the pandemic is overwhelming. This is according to the American Psychological Association. 20%, 1 in 5, say their mental health is worse. So, right, their emotional pain is worse. That's what they're saying. 92% of millennials say COVID has negatively impacted their mental health. And I need to say, I don't think this is because millennials are soft. Millennials are pretty daggum tough. I think it's because millennials are more in touch with their emotional status than many of us who are 5, 10, 15, 30 years older than them, right? And so they are in touch with their emotions and they are feeling this pain. I want to read a couple of things from you, to you too, a couple of texts I received today with permission. And I'm going to have to scroll to them. But the therapists are seeing this play out in real time. They're seeing pains come about in very visceral ways. So here's what a therapist friend texted me today. It can be an emotional drain to sit in non-judgmental silence while a politically rabid client pontificates about how stupid, evil is any view different from the client. So this is either side, especially if those views are in opposition to those of the therapist. Therapist's own wounds can be activated by such encounters. So she's saying, like, even as a therapist, my pain points are triggered. They're at a much higher level than they've ever been in this pandemic, in the racial tension, in the election. She says for clients, so many adults who seek counseling are survivors of abuse and neglect during childhood or later in adulthood. The current cultural milieu, which is a fancy French word for just the mix of the culture, is full of darkness, violence, verbal, political, and physical, uncertainty, and dissolution of social guardrails, which are reminiscent of all the chaos from which they're trying to heal. Finally, this current frighteningly divisive cultural milieu is causing long-term clients to bring to me for the first time ever long suppressed memories of childhood abuses. So she's saying somehow the chaos of the pandemic for therapists has dislodged a bunch of new pain, both for their clients and for themselves. And this is not isolated. I suspect that if there are therapists in this room, of which I am not one, they'll say much the same thing. So what we're seeing right now in the pandemic is that pain is at an all-time high point. Why? Because chaos is at an all-time high point. We are looking at something the likes of which we have never seen. And that chaos is triggering these various modes of pain, the pain of loss, the pain of scarcity, the pain of abuse, and for some of us, the actual real physical pain as you carry stress in your body. So we'll talk in the next session about why am I talking so much about the pain. What I need you to know from my own experience, pain is inextricably tied to addiction. Period. Full stop. Addiction is not something that those bad dudes do, right? Addiction is not something that people who just don't love Jesus enough do. I mean, that's kind of how you'd say it in the South. Well, she's addicted because she just don't love Jesus enough. Well, no, that's not it. Addiction is something that we do as we try to find ways to numb ourselves to the pain. And we'll talk about that more in session 2. But for now, let's take a quick break and talk some Q&A. Dave, any Q&A? Or any Q? I guess I give the A or you give the A? I can't hear you, Dave. You're muted.
There we go. It's interesting, Seth. Just an amen from a therapist that is with us tonight. Just acknowledging this different context that we're in than we've ever been in before. And I've heard that from all of my therapist friends, all of my both Christian and secular counselor friends, that what's happening now is like nothing that they've ever seen before. So that's scary, but here we are, and that's why we're doing this tonight.
Yeah.
So
yeah, go ahead.
Well, I wanted to say, do you feel like, and you cast the net pretty wide in the different kinds of things that people can be addicted to. Do you find that there's certain addictions that are flaring up more than others, or is it just kind of the pandemic just an equal opportunity exacerbator when it comes to addictions? Is that a word?
Yeah, I think we'll get more into that in section 2, but I think that's certainly true. I think as a preliminary matter, anything that makes you immediately feel good or allows you to immediately sort of disconnect from the world, those are the things that really are flaring up. So we see things like alcohol alcohol abuse has gone up pretty dramatically. Alcohol sales in the first 2 weeks of the pandemic, like if you had stock in alcohol companies, you made bank. Like it was the one industry that really wasn't struggling. I say that kind of tongue in cheek. So I don't really have any alcohol stocks. So if there's a stockbroker out there, don't hold that against me. But their sales were off the charts. Porn use was very, very high early on in the pandemic, in the addiction. Freudian slip, perhaps. In fact, there were some major porn sites that were offering free trial versions for a period of time to help people cope with the pandemic, which was to say to get them addicted, so that they would continue on. And in fact, that has continued on. I'll say for me, like just to be like super blunt, I'm kind of a information junkie. Information helps me try to sort out the chaos, even though like we don't live in a system that allows us to do that. So information helps me sort out the chaos, and entertainment helps me get away from the chaos. And so I think that we've added 2 streaming services, and I think I pay for like maybe 3 or 4 different news subscriptions that I wouldn't have paid for prior to the pandemic. So, I mean, even for me, like I'm looking and I'm saying, why am I doing that? A friend who's a therapist, actually, now that I'm saying this out loud, I'm remembering this. A friend sort of in the podcast world, we've done some collaboration before. I saw him tweet today, Apple, don't you dare send me a screen time report this week. So,
Yeah.
I mean, he's even wrestling with the fact that, yeah, like social media addiction is really high right now for him. And I think for all of us.
Here's one of the questions, Seth. That basic logic that pain is at the core of our addictive behaviors. Is that pretty universally accepted among addiction specialists, or is that one of several theories?
It's beginning to be more universally accepted, and there's a variety of reasons for that. I think, to be frank, I tend to side with the research that shows pain as the underlying emotional trigger for addiction, because it makes sense. And frankly, everyone I talk to who struggles with addiction, like they can point to it pretty clearly. And it's starting to find more favor than the sort of chemical hooks addiction theory, and here's why. They've actually done research in opioid spaces, and they've talked about how the majority of people who have surgery in the hospital and take some form of opioid in the hospital, and if they're married or they have a good community around them, there's actually some data behind this, that when they leave the hospital, they leave the opioids too. They might get a bottle of it, refill it once, surgery over, they've got a good community, they walk away. But what you see in others who just can't seem to kick the opioid stranglehold on them is that there are other extenuating circumstances, often a lack of really tight emotional community. So I think the research is showing more and more that that's true. There are certainly chemical hooks, but chemical hooks alone don't lead to long-term addiction.
Interesting. Here's another question that's coming in on the online campus. Can you talk a little bit more about how our pain gets amplified by chaos and uncertainty?
Yeah. So here's a really good one. Like, I'll just use myself as an example. So I've said that my particular pain point is scarcity, right? Never enough. There's never enough. There's never enough money. There's never enough information. There's never enough. And so, for instance, when the pandemic hit and all business started sort of slowing down, I'm in a particular industry that is very it's very affected by projected consumer behavior. Okay. And so when the pandemic hit, I was a participant in an industry that all but shut down for a couple of months. And, I'm looking around thinking, gosh, what do I do? There's never enough. There's never enough. There's never enough. And now here comes the pandemic and says, no, actually, there is probably not enough. And so I begin to spin out into what kind of information can I gather to help me make sense? How much work can I do to bring in extra money? Because work, obviously, as we all know, can be a sort of addiction. And so it sort of amplified my scarcity response. Divorce is actually extremely high right now. And I've had friends, people I know, whose spouse has come to them and said, I'm not really happy. I'm cooped up with you in a house, and I'm out. And the truth is, underlying some of that is some historical pain baggage with things like abuse or things like scarcity. And now they're looking at their spouse and they're saying, well, that's not really abusive, but boy, does it remind me of what I grew up with. I'm out. And I've heard that story not just once. I mean, I hear that story over and over and over again. And again, my therapist friends are telling me, and again, not just one, several of them are saying, look, we are seeing things we've never seen before from people that we've been seeing for years. Because there's something about the chaos that is dislodging the pain from the past.
Now I'm going to jump in real quick, Seth. Here's a question coming from Facebook Live, and I'm just going to read it to you. How much power are we giving media when we turn on news or political talk to stir the, quote, pain pot? I don't know how else to ask the question. I go to AA and to Chapel's More Than Conquer addiction ministry. So I'm asking for me and others in programs who might not want to self-identify. Thank you for that question.
Yeah, that's a phenomenal question. I think the answer to that is a lot. This is intuitive. I can't quantify this. But I've been watching the two major networks, both giving equal time, covering sort of the election. And I'm almost hesitant to do this, but I'm going to do this because I'm in Arkansas, and you guys, if you hate me, you hate me. You never have to talk to me again. But I've been watching both sides really come out swinging, villainizing, castigating, calling names. And frankly, man, when I listen to it all, it feels super abusive. And so I can imagine if I come from a history where I was constantly name called, I was constantly in an abusive relationship, uh, that I could feel abused just by watching the news, any of the news. I think that the constant diet of chaos that we're getting right now is not good, and I think it amplifies the pain points that come with chaos, and that exists. Great question. It exists in most of our major news sources on both sides, and particularly if you think of social media as an extension of media, it's really bad on social media. And so if you exist constantly on social media and you have this sort of chaotic pain that led you to booze before, that pool is going to be really hard. And we've actually seen some big name podcasters in the sobriety space sort of admit to relapse in the pandemic. And it has a lot to do with that.
Wow. All right. Great questions. And I think, Seth, we're ready to transition to the second teaching time. What do you think?
That's great. That's great. So,
Right.
so let's jump in. Now we're going to talk about what does it mean to be addicted? What is addiction? And so here's where I kind of want to really drill down. I've talked about these things this morning. And some of these things came up in the Q&A, but there's a 34% increase in alcohol consumption due to the pandemic. That's what science says, statistics are saying right now. 20% increase in smoking. There's a 16% increase in non-medicated, non-prescribed drug use. The Detroit Free Press, I saw an article that indicated that there have been, at least in that region, an increase in opioid deaths. We know that porn use is way up. And again, like I said in the Q&A, my therapist friend said, Apple, don't you dare show me a screen time report. We know right now that all of the addiction stats are sort of off the charts. And so this leads us to the question of what does pain have to do with it? And I could actually quote from several different sources, but I want to read a little bit of Gabor Mate's book, in the realm of hungry ghosts. If you're a therapist, if you're an addiction specialist, or if you're just a curious reader, this is a great book, In the Realm of Hungry Ghosts. And he writes, the hardcore drug addict's life has been marked by a surfeit of pain. No wonder she desperately craves relief. In moments, I go from complete misery and vulnerability to total invulnerability, says Judy, a 36-year-old heroin and cocaine addict who is trying to kick her 2-decade habit. I have a lot of issues, a lot of reasons why I use drugs. A lot of the reason I use is to get rid of those thoughts and emotions and cover them up. And then Mate says this, which I think is brilliant. The question is never why the addiction, but why the pain. Again, he says addictions always originate in pain, whether felt openly or hidden in the unconscious. They are an emotional anesthetics. Heroin and cocaine, both powerful physical painkillers, also ease psychological discomfort. Like we all remember, if you're my age or older, you remember the stories from the 80s where you had these big wig executives who were hard charging and always trying to get more done. And, they were always based in Manhattan, and in all those movies and all those stories, you would always see them doing lines of coke in the bathroom, right? Because they were trying to sort of ease the psychological discomfort of overworking, of trying to be too much. Or trying to be more, trying to achieve more. And that is true no matter what the shape of your pain is, scarcity, abuse, or loss. We will always turn to things that sort of give us comfort. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, and we'll get to that. But before we get to addiction, I kind of want to talk about how we categorize addiction. What do we call it? There is a school, as Dave alluded to, that really it goes with this sort of chemical hooks notion of addiction, right? I'm addicted to caffeine because caffeine makes me feel good. And there's some truth to that. It wakes me up in the morning. It helps me get to the gym or to the office or to whatever. Ergo, I do it. Like there's something to that. But specialists are now starting to say that there's actually more to it than just the chemical hooks. There is a former U.S. Surgeon General, Vivek Murthy, and he says that really when we're talking about addiction, we're not talking necessarily about dependence or withdrawal or any of these sorts of things, but what we're talking about is any compulsive behavior that has some kind of life-damaging consequences. So let's tease that out. If you are compulsively checking the news feed and you are not present with your children, then those have life-altering consequences. If you can't get away from that and you can't stop that, then Vivek Murthy, who's way smarter than I am, says that's an addiction. If you watch constantly the vitriol that spews from either side of the aisle on the news cycle, and then you go to the office and you castigate and villainize and yell at and argue with your coworkers on the other side who are listening to the other news cycle, then that has relational consequences. It has interpersonal consequences that are real, and they have life-damaging consequences, right? And so Vivek Murthy would say, these things sort of operate along the lines of addiction. Now, we know with alcohol, that's super duper clear, right? We know with porn, with drugs, that's super duper clear. We know that with eating, that can be super duper clear, right? There are people, men and women, who really struggle with their body image. And so what do? They starve themselves. And their brain says, okay, now maybe we can look a little bit better. And they get addicted to that feeling of maybe I can look a little bit better. And as a result, they develop these eating disorders. And the same is true on the flip side. I feel pain. I don't feel well. And so I'm going to eat all the cereal in my pantry, and then I'm going to follow it up with some ice cream and have a couple burgers. And, I'm going to eat my feelings, as you hear people say these days. Again, if there's pain and you're trying to use something habitually to fix that pain and it has life-altering consequences, then the experts these days are saying that is a thing that is or is akin to addiction. Okay. So when we talk about addiction, my opinion is that we need to be really careful that we're not sort of using addictive language to say, oh, the guys who have addictions, that's those guys, like the drug users, the porn users, the alcohol users, it's those guys. They have addictions. I don't have an addiction. Well, dude, you just spent 7 hours watching a particular news network and getting all anxious and all excited, and then going to the office and railing against your coworker. Come on, man. Like, if you can't turn off the tube, then maybe you have your own addiction problem. Or perhaps, and I've heard this over and over again, you find yourself late at night sitting at the computer, click, 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 click. And I'm not talking about porn. I'm talking about your Amazon shopping cart, and you can't stop. And maybe at the end of the night, you don't even buy anything. You purge your shopping cart. It's another way of binging and purging. And for some reason, in that moment, you feel better. It's an escape. Well, Vivek Murthy would say that might function as an addiction. So we need to be really careful that we're not dismissing it because of physical hooks, the physical hooks theory. It's not booze, it's not porn, it's not opioids. And we need to look at our own habits and say, if they're compulsive and if they have life-damaging consequences, then perhaps we should take a really hard look. Now, listen. This is where it gets super in the weeds, and there are going to be doctors here. There are going to be therapists here that know this stuff. And I want to explain to you, why do these things happen? And listen, they're not all bad. The chemicals that release in your brain when you drink wine are not all bad. They've been given to us for a reason. The chemicals that release when you have sex, the chemicals that release when you buy something. There are chemicals that release when you buy something. These things are not all bad. They've been given to us for a reason. And I want to delve into that a little bit, okay? So we have been given feelings of pleasure to help us understand that God created the world to be good. He created the world around us to be good. Everything that's created, that comes from the mind of man, can be created and used for good. Unfortunately, we misuse it, but he gave us brain chemistry to say, this feels good for a reason. So here's some examples. We know that when you're lonely, if you go to a faith gathering, 50 people in a room, you sing some songs, you pray some prayers, you connect with God, you connect with others, you have these conversations, and now you don't feel lonely anymore. You feel connected, you feel loved. The brain releases a chemical, it's called dopamine, and it says, hey, pay attention. That feeling that you just had of connection, that's a good thing. Like, do that more, right? When you're hungry and you go and you find this salty, fatty cheeseburger and you eat it, and it satiates your hunger and you feel good, and your brain releases all these chemicals that say, okay, these neurochemicals that say, okay, that felt good. Your brain also releases dopamine, and dopamine says, hey, remember that feeling. That was really good. So the next time you're hungry, do that again. When somebody has had surgery and they take opioid, there are certain endorphins and certain other neurochemicals that are released that help dull and kill the pain. And your body releases dopamine again and says, hey, this feels good. If you ever have surgery again, like, maybe you should try these drugs again. It's pretty good stuff. Okay. So your body learns, your brain learns that when I have pain, I can treat it in these certain ways. And God did that for a reason. He did that to be a signaler to us that pleasure is meant to remind us that he actually cares about us. Like, he wants us to eat, so it feels good to eat. He wants us to procreate, so it feels good to have sex. He wants us not to hurt, so he created scientists who are genius enough to take the poppy and give us some opioids, right? But here's what we do. We can take those things and we can amp them up. And as a result, we can misuse them and become addicted to those things. So here are some examples of that, okay? Social media is a great example. 10,000 years ago, or 2,000 years ago, or heck, 100 years ago, if you felt lonely, you went to your neighborhood bar, you went to your neighborhood church, you went to your neighborhood, caveman meeting. There was only so much interaction you could have, right? But now I can get on Twitter and I can scroll and interact and scroll and interact. I can have thousands of interactions in 10 minutes. And my brain is saying, oh, this is something akin to, interaction with people so you don't feel lonely. And it dumps dopamine into the brain that says, yeah, this feels good. Let's keep doing this. And that dopamine continues to remind you, hey, social media, it kind of was the fix. Like, let's go do that some more, right? More. And it becomes a knee-jerk reaction. It becomes habituated because your brain is saying, when I'm lonely, let's go do this thing that dumps massive amounts of dopamine into your brain. I often talk about this in the way of food too, right? So consider food. If you were alive in Jesus's day and you were walking around and you got hungry, you kind of probably had to walk a few blocks, maybe go to somebody's house, go to the butcher's house, buy a chicken, which probably costs a lot of money. And then you could eat that chicken. You could probably only eat 300 or 400 calories worth of chicken if you're really hungry, because man, it just can't eat that much stuff, right? And your brain releases dopamine. It says, hey, next time you're hungry, go do this thing. But now I can go down to the Harp's food store, which is our local version, and I can buy a packet of Oreos and I can eat 1,000 calories in 10 minutes. And my brain releases so much dopamine to say, oh, all these calories, like this stuff is good, right? In the same way, think about sex. In the old days, in days gone by, you had a limited amount of sexual partners, right? You only had so much you could do. Now you can get on the internet and scroll and scroll and scroll and scroll and have thousands of sexual partners in 30 minutes, in an hour. And your body, your brain, every time just dumps that dopamine and says, yes, that kills the pain. That feels good. Yes, that feels that kills the pain. That feels good. And so what we see is that we have actually amped up all of these behaviors that were given to us for pleasure, that were given to us for good. We've hijacked them and amped them up, and we've created versions that are on steroids that cause these sorts of responses in our brain. And that brain tells us in those moments, this feels good. You don't feel the pain of scarcity. You don't feel the pain of loss. For a minute, you're anesthetized and everything's cool. And there's so much of that going on in your brain chemistry that when the pain comes back, what do you turn to? The things that you know work: food, porn, opioids, a Netflix binge. By the way, we know that in a Netflix binge, your brain releases certain kinds of neurochemicals that almost put you in a hypnotic trance state, and that your brain dumps dopamine to say, hey, remember this, go back to this. We know that happens. And so what we see, particularly in the pandemic, when pain is amped up and when we have these amped up vices, we turn to them again and again and again. And that's why we see addiction way off the chart. Now, before we go to the Q&A on this section, which I think will be pretty robust, what I really want you to know and what I really want you to hear, okay, so pay attention to this. Don't lose me here. These things are not bad. These chemicals are not bad. It is not bad that we feel good after having sex. That is not bad, right? God created pleasure. It is not bad that you feel good after eating a cheeseburger. It is not bad that you feel good after eating an Oreo. For some of you, you can have a glass of wine and stop. And that feeling that comes is not an innately negative thing. I don't think God looked down and thought, holy crap, they figured out how to ferment grapes. What are we going to do? No, I don't think that happened. I think he very well knew what creation was going to do and what we were going to do with creation. And he gave us the brain chemistry to deal with that. So one of the things that I want to be really careful about, and I want to talk through with you guys, is to know that God gave us pleasure for a reason. And that pleasure was meant to point us to him. As the Psalms say, that we believe that we will see the goodness of the Lord in the land of the living. You could even say the pleasures created by the Lord in the land of the living. And one of my favorite discussions of this topic is actually from C.S. Lewis in the Screwtape Letters. And he talks about how in this, you may know the story, but in this, there's a sort of a chief demon talking to an underling. And as he's talking to his underling, he's saying, you know, God has given these creatures, these humans, pleasures forevermore. He kind of scoffs, and he says those pleasures are no good to us unless we can twist them. Unless we can get our claws into the people by twisting the pleasures to draw them away from God and into their pleasures and their pleasures alone. That's when pleasure becomes really good from a spiritual perspective, from a negative spiritual perspective, right? So as we move on into the last session and as we move into this Q&A, just remember, like, pleasure is not a bad thing. Pleasure is a good thing, but it has to be rightly ordered. Pleasure in and of itself cannot and will not cure the pain of our lives.
Man, Seth, I love that. I just wrote down, God gave us pleasure to point us to him. What a beautiful thought, in God's creative love for us. So here's the biggest question that I have heard many times and continue to hear even tonight. With the definition of addiction that you have given us with Dr. Vivek Murthy and other experts that are, for the most part, no longer limiting addiction to the chemical hooks, but it goes way beyond that, right? So why do we still hear so often addiction is a disease? So what do you think about that? You've probably been asked that 1,000 times.
Yeah.
Is addiction a disease? I'll just leave it at that. Is addiction a disease, and why or why not?
Yeah, again, I think we got to be really careful here, because to limit it to a disease it can be a way of, boy, this is going to sound really bad. So your therapists are probably going to jump all over me right now, but to limit it to a disease theory um, uh, can actually serve as a way to sort of let the struggler off the hook, right? Like they can't help it. It's just a disease. And so of course there's going to be relapse, and there may well be, but it's just a disease, just like you can't control cancer, you can't control addiction. And I probably to some degree lean more to that camp than the other camp, which is the habit camp. There's a great writer out of Biola who writes about this, St. Thomas Aquinas and also Augustine, and their views of habit formation and how addiction is essentially habit formation, which is sort of the physical manifestation of spiritual direction, right? And they kind of put it more in the habit area. And the reason they do that is because of the science. When you engage in a habit, your body dumps dopamine to say, hey, remember that this habit worked for you. And so, you form these very sticky habits. The problem with the habit philosophy is that it tends to be a little bit more of a pull yourself up by your bootstraps mentality. And I don't think that's right either. The reason I land a little bit more closely to chemical hooks is because what we're starting to realize about the brain, particularly about the dopamine dump, is that a dopamine dump is a chemical hook, right? It actually pulls you back to the thing that worked. And so in a sense, it is a chemical hook. That's why I land a little bit more to the disease part philosophy. But I'll tell you, I'm not an addiction therapist. I'm not a scientist. And I'm not a habit formation guru, which I don't know that anybody really is, but that's a whole nother conversation that we can have later. And so what I would say is, like, regardless of what camp you end up in, whether somebody says it's a disease or whether somebody says a habit, I don't really care. That's not really where we need to land. Where we need to land is with the recognition that pleasure causes certain chemicals to release in the brain. Pleasure is not bad. Pleasure can be hijacked, and sometimes we allow it to be hijacked. And that we need to order our pleasures in the right way, so that whether it's a disease or whether it's a habit, it doesn't really matter, because our pleasures are ordered under God.
Okay. Could you say just a little bit more about how, if you take a pure disease model, how that can be counterproductive?
Yeah, I've talked to some addiction specialists about this, and so again, I'm going to have to channel really that kind of their answer to me, and their answer is that, and also I should say that some disease addiction specialists disagree with this, but their answer to me has been, when you call it a disease, a person can sort of get this helpless feeling of like, oh, well, I've got this disease. It's like cancer. I can never beat it. I'll always be addicted to this thing. I'll always have this disease. I'll always struggle with this disease. And it can become a real mind trip. And it can actually be counterproductive and lead to a lot of relapse. And it also can be, in a sense, according to some, it can be a way of like leading almost to a coddling of the person who is struggling, to where you never actually draw hard boundaries because, hey, they're just struggling with a disease. So we just let them struggle with their disease and we'll always be there. So it can sort of amp up some codependent sort of tendencies sometimes that exist. Again, like, there are both sides to this. People disagree and agree with this. And your therapist right now online will probably, you would probably have some in both camps.
Okay. So just one more question on that, in that vein. In your experience, does it seem to be, do you see it run in families, or where there almost seems to be a genetic propensity for some people that they just can't handle whether it be alcohol or other things. They just seem to get, people talk about an addictive personality, right?
Yeah.
Maybe that's my question. Is there such thing
Yeah.
as an addictive personality, do you think?
Yeah, sure. I mean, people who have constant pain are always going to be reaching for something to kill the pain. So, yeah, man, if my personality is the kind that is comfortable and enjoys chaos, or is comfortable sitting in, not sitting in my pain, is comfortable running from my pain, then yeah, maybe. To go back to your original question, though, that's actually a really fascinating one. Does addiction run in family circles? I think it does. I don't know if it's genetic. I don't know that science is super clear about whether it's genetic. In fact, some scientists are now saying that with respect to alcohol, that tends to be more of a learned addiction than a genetic addiction. And we're also hearing, which is something I hadn't heard until 5 years ago. We're also hearing now that after a certain season of addiction, your brain can actually repair some of the pathways, so that your brain is actually a living, growing thing that can sort of grow out of some of those addiction tendencies if you have the right kind of treatment, right? Which typically tends to be abstinence. And in fact, some of the brain science says that if you've abstained for 2 years, I think, or that there's a period, maybe 18 months, that many of the old neural pathways have reconnected. Maybe not through the same pathways that have been damaged, but in other ways. And so you can actually grow neural pathways to help you fight addiction.
Wow.
So I think the research right now is as far as I keep up with it, is actually, it's kind of changing, as is all science these days, I think. And so it makes it very difficult for me to talk about it in a way that is not in a 100,000 word book, citing a whole lot of sources.
Yeah, sure.
People who are much smarter than I.
Yeah. Just a quick comment on the online campus. Someone said, if you look at a disease like diabetes, it is the behaviors of the person that will determine the quality of their life. So maybe that's a logical, different way to say what you're saying. It comes down
analogy.
to it. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a great analogy. And here's why, right? Because we know that diabetes, in a lot of senses, comes from bad habit formation. And we know now that a lot of the cure for diabetes, which is a disease, can be cured through proper new habit formation and treatment. But new habit formation, we can reverse some of those effects. And so maybe that's a really good analog for what we're talking about. There's a disease chemical hooks component, but there's also this habit formation component. And to look at one without the other is really not doing the whole thing justice.
Both ends. That's good.
I'm going to jump in here with another Facebook question. This is from two young men, ages 25 and 28. In the pandemic, we are seeing alcohol sales jump like you outlined earlier. But in social settings, we have also heard people almost daily in our experience celebrate and make light of the increased drinking. Addict or not, how does a person address this? Or is this something we bite our tongues on? A great example is a family member drinking double what they used to and then bragging about it. Is this something that we address?
This may take a minute to answer the question, but can that person indicate whether or not they may not be able to, but if they've struggled with alcohol?
The person asking the question?
Yeah.
Yeah. I'll see if they answer.
Okay. Well, I'll start riffing and then you just interrupt me. Okay. So yes, that's a huge deal. It's actually been really painful for a lot of my friends who have decided to take a pandemic break. I've had several friends say, like, I'm not drinking during the pandemic. And even saying, like, I don't think I have a problem. Not 100% sure, but I'm not drinking during the pandemic. But now everybody's at home all the time. And so, the tweeting, the Facebooking, the phone calls about how much people are drinking and sort of celebrating, oh, I get to drink more. Ha ha ha. It's so funny. It's actually really painful to them. And it's painful to them because they are making a conscious choice to not drink, like to try to do the hard work of understanding their pain, understanding why they drink, and to try to take a break, to do the hard work of finding healing. And so it can be very, very painful to those people. I know when I stopped drinking, this was way pre-pandemic. yeah, I like people would brag about how much they drank, and I just thought, man, first of all, have some emotional intelligence, dude. You know I don't drink. Like that's painful for you to talk about drinking in front of me is wrecked. I'm okay now, but in the early days it was really hard. Um, and I think one of the things that we need to be really cognizant of in the pandemic, particularly, it's not just alcohol, but I think we need to be really cognizant of the ways we talk about alcohol consumption, food consumption, intimacy issues at home, or intimacy bragging. Because listen, I've heard people bragging post pandemic, and I'm just like, man, come on, are we 18 and in the locker room again? We need to be really cognizant of the ways that we're talking about these things, because there are people who really, really struggle with them. And these things can actually trigger pain points. And listen, I'm not a big like, hey, don't trigger me guy, but like, hey, y'all, don't trigger people. Be smart.
Yeah.
Don't keep talking about this. So in their situation, one of the things I would say is that if these things,
And Seth, just to qualify, it's split. There's two people. One is
Okay.
in addiction, and the other is in addiction recovery. One is just a normal average drinker.
That's great. So here's what I would say. For the normal average drinker, one, be terribly careful about the ways you talk about how much you drink. If you drink more, if you drink less, just be careful. And also do the work. Like it kind of all boils down in life, I think, to love God, love your neighbor. So when you hear this as the person who's not really struggling with alcohol, like love your neighbor, act on behalf of your neighbor and say, hey man, you don't know where I am with alcohol. I could really be struggling. And you definitely don't know how everyone else you're talking to this way is doing with alcohol. And a lot of people are struggling in the pandemic with alcohol. So you might think about new ways to talk about this. Like, and also maybe examine your relationship with alcohol. I think in the pandemic, if you have a personal relationship with person, you need to be bold enough to make those kinds of statements to people and to be super straightforward, which I've found that people from New Jersey never seem to have a problem with, which is a good thing. For the person who's struggling, listen, like be clear, and I say struggling, you may be in recovery for years and be fine, but be super clear with the people who are bragging that, hey, look, this is not good for me. Like, I know you're not thinking about it in a negative way, but in the pandemic, there are people who are struggling with increased addiction, and I might be one of them. And so maybe we should rethink the way we talk about alcohol. I think it's time for us to be really clear about this stuff.
That's really good. That's really good. And I think that's a great time to transition to our third and final teaching time. You ready for it, Seth?
Let's do it.
All
I'm going
right.
to have a sip of my tea. And I'm going to tell you guys, speaking of good pleasures, I am drinking this amazing tea I really love. It's called A Gentleman and a Scholar. So it's named for all of you people. And it tastes like apples and oak. So it feels like when I'm talking about sobriety, I should always say, like, this is the tea that I drink when I'm talking about sobriety. It makes me feel happy because it fills me with pleasure.
You know, Seth, as you're drinking that, I have to say one of the memorable images from your first book was when you talked about just the aesthetic pleasure of making tea. I think that was your book, wasn't it?
Yeah, totally. Yeah, it was, and it was this strawberry green tea that it's actually the same tea company. We have this local tea mixologist, I guess, tea company blender called Savoy, and they had this green tea with this like hint of strawberry that was so good. And when I stopped drinking, the ritual of it, sort of the liturgy of making tea was huge because it got me in a new habit formation. But also I started noticing that I could like actually feel new pleasures again. So I wasn't so drunk all the time. I wasn't so numbed out on life that the pleasures of life really could come awake, particularly new things like taste and smell. So,
right.
Yeah.
Yeah. I love that. Cause I love that it can, I think people don't even think about it because they're so thinking about alcohol dependency as primarily a chemical hook. Right.
Yeah.
or that people do it to relax or to lose their inhibition or, things like that. But there is, like you say, there's a beautiful aesthetic to a beautiful wine glass or whatever, right?
Yeah, totally.
And that we can capture those beautiful aesthetics and the ritual, like you said, in
Yes.
many different ways. And I just thought there's a lot there that we don't usually think about. So
And
enjoy
listen,
your
like, yeah, and to go as we move into the sobriety session, like I think that's important to say. Like I yes, alcohol made me feel a certain way. Okay. But I drank a gin that was called Gordon's Gin. It's swill. Man, it tastes like fire. And I bought the cheapest version of Gordon's Gin, right? And I would mix my gin and tonics a certain way for the most part, um, because that's how my grandpa did it. And so every time I had chaos or every time I had pain, I could go back to this drink and it would take me back to northern Louisiana, sitting on the back porch with my grandpa, looking at the bayou, watching the wood ducks come in, watching the mallards come in, having deep conversations, tasting this juniper, tasting this fire. And there was something about it that was very, very comforting, aside from the feeling that I got. Um, Pleasure brings us places. It takes us back in our mind to places. It sort of operates sometimes along the lines of nostalgia, and that's not a bad thing in and of itself. Um, but when we talk about sobriety, I love this quote. There's a quote by Mary Carr, who is a poet. She's a teacher, a professor in your neck of the woods. I think it's at Syracuse in the creative writing department. She's written a series of books that are amazing. She's a believer. She's a Catholic. And she writes about her journey into Christianity and Catholicism through her inebriation, through coming out of inebriation into recovery. She has a book called Lit. It's one of my favorite books. It's an amazing book. Should have won a Pulitzer, and it did not. And that's a travesty. But again, another conversation. In that book, she writes this: "We were not made to wallow in pleasure. Pleasure is joy's assassin."
take.
I love that line. And what she's saying is like, look, there may not be anything necessarily wrong with alcohol. But when you use that thing, when you go back to that thing over and over and over again, when you go to the pleasure over and over again to kill the pain, then what you find is that you can't actually access real joy. And for any of those of you who love poetry, write this down. Her poem, Viper Rum, is an amazing poem. And it talks about how she is in this beautiful, amazing experience. And there's this rum offered to her, and it would be culturally appropriate and it would be perfect, but she knows where to lead her. And so she walks away. And you just get this palpable sense of relief when you read the poem. I love that. I love her writing. I love her writing on addiction and recovery, particularly Lit and Viper Rum. So let's move into the idea of sobriety then from that sort of jumping off a place. I'm very loath to say that sobriety is doing or not doing a thing. Okay. So to me, if I were able to white knuckle my way through never drinking again, does that necessarily mean that I am sober? Right? In addiction circles, the answer to that would be yes. The answer to that would be, if I were to take another drink, that I would somehow have broken my sobriety, regardless of whether or not I got drunk. That would be, in sobriety circles, the way we talk about sobriety: to drink or not to drink, to porn or not to porn, to heroin or not to heroin. And listen, for some very good reasons, some of those things are true, right? If you have a heroin addiction and you shoot up, guess what? You're not sober anymore. It's like impossible to use heroin in moderation. So in some circles, it's very important that we say like you can't ever do that again. That is what it means to be sober. For some people, and this is a little bit controversial, but I'll root this in a couple of different spaces. For some people, they can never touch alcohol again. They should never touch alcohol again. There are some underlying things, whether it's, pain points or whether it's chemical hooks, I don't know. Whether it's maybe nostalgia, like you just got to stay away from it. Like never drink it again. But there are therapists who walk people through a moderation therapy, and this happens here. It happens across the pond over in Europe. And they say, listen, like, let's deal with the underlying pain and let's get that cleaned up. And let's not focus on to drink or not to drink. There may be a season when you have to make a decision. You're never drinking again. But for now, what we need to do is focus on the pain and get to the root of that and really find real healing. So for me, the question is not necessarily to drink or not to drink, although that is a question that you have to ask yourself if you're struggling with addiction. There's a story that I read. It was a New York Times article. It was called Off the Drugs and On to the Cupcakes, which is a terrible title for an article. But in that article, there was a gentleman who was struggling with heroin addiction, and he kicked his heroin addiction, and then he started going to NA. And at NA, what he found was a group of people who were chain smoking in the back. He found M&Ms at all these, his NA chapters, they would have M&Ms and chocolate and cupcakes and sweets and all this kind of stuff. And there's a reason for that, because when your body breaks down heroin, it breaks it down. There's a sugary component in it that sort of operates as one of the hooks to like get you in addition to endorphins, in addition to dopamine, in addition to all the things, right? And so what they found is that like it actually can help you get off heroin if you eat a lot of sugar, right? But what he found is that he ballooned up to just an astronomical weight for him. He went from nothing to way overweight, and now his weight was an issue and was causing him health problems. And he had transferred one addiction to the next, right? He had transferred his addiction from heroin to an addiction for sugar. For me, perhaps sometimes I transfer my addiction from alcohol consumption over consumption to information over consumption, or social media over consumption, or work over consumption. And if, going back to Vivek Murthy, if I transfer that addiction to another habit that's unhealthy, am I sober? So if I have this pain point that's leading me to use heroin, and I don't deal with the pain point, but I kick the heroin and I use sugar to now deal with the pain point, use the pleasure of sugar, wallow in that pleasure to sort of fall asleep to the pain point, then am I sober? And that became the real question for me. And here's where it really came home. This is where the research started for me. I was talking with a woman who was really struggling with an eating disorder. And she said to me, you do realize that you're the luckiest addict in the room. And it was a really weird statement. And I said, why would you say that? What do you mean? And she said, well, you have an alcohol issue. So you can just like never drink again. I have an eating disorder. I can't never eat again. I'll die. And besides that, that's kind of the problem. So the question for her could not be to eat or not to eat. The question for her had to be, how do I resolve the underlying pain point that is giving me this body image? How do I take that to God in a way that helps me be grounded? And then how do I make sure that my relationship with food is good and right so that I can take or leave food when I need it? If I need it, I can eat it. If I don't need it, I don't have to eat it. I can take it or leave it, pick it up, put it down. And when she said that to me, it really unlocked this idea for me that sobriety has to be something bigger than to drink or not to drink. Okay. So that's the foundational position that I'm going to start out with as we talk about sobriety. So for me, again, the question is not about doing or not doing. To me, the question is also not about judging someone else's sobriety based on doing or not doing. That's huge. Now listen, again, if somebody is doing heroin, you can kind of say, hey, yo, stop doing heroin. Like if somebody's lining out Coke on the weekends, like you can tell them. The question really is to do or to not do. If there's a massive gambling problem, somebody's, wasting thousands of dollars gambling, like there's some pretty clear things that we can just say, like, you shouldn't do that. But for me, the place is not to judge someone based on to do or not to do. Here's a question I get asked a lot. Hey, Seth, I start thinking about alcohol at 3:30. I come home from the office. I have a drink. It doesn't quite do it. I pour myself another double. It kind of takes the edge off. I don't really drink again, after about 7, 8 o'clock. It doesn't seem to be affecting me. Do I have a drinking problem? Well, man, I can't tell you the answer to that. I can't tell you if you're addicted, if you're sober or not. I can't tell you that because that's a personal question. It's a personal exercise. It's not about drinking or not drinking. It's about, hey, what is the alcohol doing for you? And are you avoiding the pain by using the alcohol? If you are, then yeah, man, you need to take a step back and you need to ask, do I need to evaluate my relationship with alcohol? As we talked about before, pleasure is God-given. I believe that I will see the goodness of God in the land of the living. I believe that the goodness of God is expressed through food, drink, sex, wearing, buying clothes, buying things, hunting. I'm a hunter. I went and hunted this sweater a couple of years ago, and I've always liked it. Always makes me feel good when I wear it. Connection, right? Like interpersonal friendship, connection. Like I believe all of these things, these pleasures were created by God for our good, so long as they're not twisted. And so when I started thinking about what does it mean to be sober, I had a therapist friend, his name's Ryan. And Ryan sent me an article or a YouTube video, series of YouTube videos by a group of therapists who actually served in your neck of the woods in New York City, Manhattan, after 9/11. And they practiced a sort of therapy called EFT, emotionally focused therapy. And what they showed, it's kind of it's used a lot in marital models. So this is not an addiction form of therapy. But what they found is that when two people who were married and were having marital strife and struggle and were not well attached, were not well emotionally attached, that their outcomes in life were worse. So for instance, people who were not well attached to their spouse recovered from things like cancer at much slower rates. They recovered from addiction at much slower rates. They tended to have a more negative view of life. They tended to die earlier because they didn't have proper emotionally focused attachment to their spouse. They didn't have a partner. They didn't have someone on their side, right? They didn't have somebody to help them carry the load, to carry the weight. So I started thinking about this mode of attachment. And as it would turn out, as I'm thinking about attachment and really recovering from cancer and recovering from addiction, I started wondering, have any spiritual writers of the past really talked about the pleasures of life and attachment? And I found that, lo and behold, there was a 16th century Spanish monk named Ignatius of Loyola who spent a lot of time developing a spiritual exercise model around this very thing. And it set me free. And I want to share it with you guys because for me, like, this is everything. Like, as a Christian, as a follower in the way of Jesus, it really makes everything make sense and unlocks everything. And it unlocks the idea that pleasure is meant to draw us into good, that we are meant to serve the ultimate good, which is God, and that we're really meant to use the things of earth to bring us closer into connection with him. So here's how St. Ignatius of Loyola started. He said, the chief aim of man is to love, serve, and reverence God. Makes some sense, doesn't it? Like, think about Jesus' greatest command. Love God, right? Love God with all your heart, soul, and mind, strength. The chief aim of man and women, I should say, because that kind of sounded sexist. And listen, it is 2020. But the chief aim of men and women is to praise, to love, serve, and honor God. then he has this other, the next step. All things in the world are created because of God's love, and they're meant to draw us into his love. Pleasure is meant to show us, hey, God kind of likes you a lot, right? He gave you the good stuff to show you that he likes you. And that makes some sense. I mean, why do you give your kids good gifts? Is it because you hate them? No, you like them. You want them to have pleasure. You want them to enjoy life. So we were created to love, serve, and reverence God, to be in relationship with him. He created good things so that we would say, hey, thanks for loving us and giving us good things. That's amazing, right? And then here's the third step. He says, and I'm going to read this because I think I want to get the language of this very precise. We show reverence for all the gifts of creation and collaborate with God in using them, so that by being good stewards, we develop as loving persons in our care for God's world and in its development. But if we abuse any of these gifts of creation, or on the contrary, take them as the center of our lives, we break our relationship with God and hinder our growth as loving persons. Now, this is a modern recasting of his third point. Put more simply, Ignatius would say this: to the extent that the created things of the world keep you from loving, serving, and reverencing God, put them away. Okay, put them away, put them down, walk away from them. So here's what he says. Here's what he's saying. And here's what he says in other parts of the book. He actually talks about this on eating. It's kind of amazing to listen to this old dude talk about eating or not eating. But what he's saying is, in life, we create attachments. Remember that word, attachment? We create attachments to people, to pleasures, to things. And those attachments are really meant only to draw us through to God. We are only meant to seek connection with our spouses and our children and our friends as really signs of God's goodness in the world. And when we experience the joy of those relationships, we are meant to say, thank you, God, for the pleasure of connection. When I eat a good meal, I had this meal one time, I did not deserve it. It was cooked by, I was invited to this really shishi place. And I was given this really shishi meal. It was before I stopped drinking, and it was this very precisely made foie gras, which is fatted goose liver, with a sauterne that was very old, a wine that was so old, and together those things, like, it's still to this day the best meal I've ever eaten. And when I think about it, my eyes could almost roll back in my head, and I think, God, you did this for us. Like you created this for us. Now, I grew attached in the wrong way to the sauterne, no doubt about that. But like, these pleasures are meant to draw us through to him. But what Ignatius says is that though those things are meant to draw us through to God, sometimes we attach to those first instead of God. We attach to the lesser loves ahead of God. And so now what happens? Well, when there's a pain in my life, instead of going to God and saying, God, help me tend to this pain, heal this pain, help me unpack it, draw me to a good therapist who can help me unpack it and deal with it and tend with it and heal from it. Instead, because our attachments are out of order, now we turn to alcohol first. We turn to booze first, drugs first, Netflix first, Twitter first, gaming first. We turn to all these other things first. We don't want to be alone with ourselves. We don't want to hear our pain, and we definitely don't want to take it to God to get healed. And so what we do is we insert as our primary attachment something that is meant to be ordered under God. And that thing blocks us from experiencing the goodness of God in the land of the living. And so what he says is, put it away. Maybe not even put it away forever, because he talks about eating. And he says, listen, to the extent that you have an addiction to eating these sumptuous meals, eat things that are less sumptuous. eat things that are a little bit more common, maybe Kraft macaroni and cheese or something. I don't know, whatever today's version of that would be, but don't get so wrapped up in food that you forget that it's meant to draw you through to my goodness. Don't get so wrapped up in sex that you forget that it's meant to draw you through to the goodness that I've given you, the pleasure that I've given you in the land of the living. And so what he says is we have to learn to reorder our attachments. Our primary attachment cannot be alcohol. If it is alcohol, we don't get through to God. We stop. Our primary attachment cannot be sex. If it is sex, we never get through to God. Why? Because, as Mary Carr says, we wallow in the pleasure. That thing helps us forget about the pain for a minute, right? We can't wallow in the pleasure of food as a primary attachment. If we do those things, we'll never find healing. And so what we need to do is flip the attachments, reorder our attachments, get in proper attachment mode, first to God, and then ordering everything else underneath him and using them only to the extent that they help us understand the goodness of God in the land of the living. So let's go back. The question that the friend asks me and that I get asked all the time, do I have a drinking problem? My question is this: are you using the alcohol to numb yourself to the pain of life? Are you using it so that you don't have to sit alone with yourself and say, golly, this hurts. God, help me. Like, Lord Jesus Christ, Son of God, have mercy on me and heal me from this pain. We see this like mad in the pandemic, right? Like, if I sit alone with myself, I begin to think about the chaos of the election, the chaos of the pandemic, the fact that I can't fly to be with you in New Jersey, which is a real pain point for me. I start to think about the struggles of the racial tensions, particularly in the South. I am on a thread with some very dear friends who see the world differently than I do because their skin color is different than mine. And the anxiety that they hold and that they carry is real. It is not false. And that anxiety rubs off on me. And if I sit alone in my room and I think about those things long enough, I start to feel the pain of scarcity. There's not enough. God, where are you? I mean, I start to pray those Psalms of David. God, how long, oh Lord? Like, where are you? Come, eradicate the enemies, like break it all down. Like, that is the attempt, the psalmist's attempt to say, I feel the pain. I struggle with the pain. I'm alone in the pain, but I'm asking you to come into the pain with me and to connect with you and help me understand the pain that I'm dealing with. That's a proper response. But what we've done in the pandemic, so many of us, is we've turned to the lesser loves. We've turned to the easy fixes to try to help ourselves feel better for a season, for a time, for a short spit of a minute, to try to numb ourselves to sleep instead of being primarily attached to God. So there are tons of ways that we can seek to primarily attach to God. And these are things that, I've written about, I've talked about. Frankly, they were a whole lot different before the pandemic. My hope is that we'll get some of them back, right? But I think a lot about a few things. One, what are some primary ways to attach to God? Well, first of all, sit alone, recognize your pain, and then turn to attachment to God in prayer, right? I feel this. God, I don't like the way I feel. I'm offering this to you as a prayer point. And I don't know why this works, but it works. I mean, if you don't believe me, just try it for 2 weeks and see what happens. If you sit alone with your pain and you take it to God and you say, God, this hurts. I feel chaos in my soul, even if I can't define the particular pain point. Would you please come and tend to it with me? I'm putting away the vices for a season, whatever those may be, to sort of wrestle this out with you. I promise you that he'll show up. So one, recognize your pain and turn to God in prayer. I gave some tools to do that this morning at the chapel. If you haven't watched that, you can sort of go back and do that. two, and this is a big one, like community is huge. It's huge. Like turn into your community, have connection in the community. In community, we do things like pray together, right? It fosters connection with one another and it fosters connection with God. And those things can be ways of inviting God to help heal us from our pain. We do things like singing. Hey, listen, you may not like to sing, but almost everyone I know knows when singing is good and when music is good. And there's a pleasure release that comes from, singing songs and listening to good music. And so when we do that in community together, even if it's online community like we had this morning, God is saying, like, that's the kind of pleasure I want you to seek, a pleasure that draws you through to me. In my tradition, in liturgical traditions, we have the Eucharist, where we actually take bread and we actually take wine. And we say, God, you are using this bread and wine to draw me deeper into relationship with you. You guys may do that at the chapel. You may do communion, whatever you do. It's saying the elements of the earth, the good stuff of the earth, the grapes, the wheat, you've given it to us for our pleasure, and you've given it to us as a way of attaching to you and understanding you. And this is very different. This community of faith is very different than the ways that addicts operate. And in fact, we see this in Paul's writing in Ephesians 5. And he says to us, I'll actually read it to you. Ephesians 5:15. Look carefully then how you walk, not as unwise, but as wise, making the best use of time because the days are evil. Therefore, do not be foolish, but understand what the will of the Lord is. And do not get drunk with wine, for that is debauchery, but be filled with the Spirit, addressing one another with psalms and hymns and spiritual songs, singing and making melody in your heart, giving thanks to always for everything to God the Father in the name of our Lord Jesus Christ, submitting to one another out of reverence for Christ. That is the strangest passage. Some of you may remember me saying this or reading this. It's so bizarre. He's saying, don't be drunk, but instead go around to each other singing, which please don't ever just show up at my house and sing a song. That would be weird. And I would probably judge you a little bit. But what I think Paul is saying is the community of faith has been given to us to lead us to attachment first to God. Drinking is an act of isolation. Drunkenness, particularly, he's saying, is an act of isolation. People can get drunk in isolation and can lose sight of the wisdom of community. So don't go off and do the things of isolation. Instead, come together and allow the songs and the teachings and the faith of the community to draw you through to God. He doesn't say don't have wine in community. If he did, then I would have a real problem every Sunday at the Eucharist, at least pre-pandemic. Now, nobody drinks from the same cup anymore. You don't get to do that. You don't even get to pass little cups around. You don't get to do anything anymore. But if it was all about drinking or not drinking, then I wouldn't get to participate in the goodness of God in the land of the living. I don't think that's what anyone is saying in the scriptures. I think instead what they're saying is don't participate in isolating addictions that terminate with attachment to the thing. Instead, come join the community that always and primarily seeks attachment to God first, and then use all things in the community only as they serve to draw you through to God. So I know that's a lot. I know we're pushing time, but I want you to know that, again, when I talk about sobriety, the definition of true spiritual sobriety that I try to work out in my own life is, am I primarily attached to God? Am I loving, serving, and reverencing him? Am I viewing all the things that he has given as primarily geared to help me love, serve, and reverence him? And to the extent that I don't see something as drawing me through to love, serve, and reverence him, can I put it away for a season until I can make sure that that thing will not block my primary attachment with God first through Christ? So that's what sobriety is to me. And I know with that, there's probably a lot of questions. I would have loved to have done that over an hour.
We packed a lot in, that's for sure. And Seth, thank you. A biblically rich, theologically rich way to think about sobriety. I so appreciate that. And like you said, I think you're stretching the minds of a lot of people. Jamie, was there a final question that came in through the Facebook chat?
Yeah, I have actually, let's see, there's one here. It was a little bit early on in the third segment, Seth. And the question was, how do you deal with pain, with the pain point? And I think you kind of went on to answer that question. So I don't know if you want to expand on that, but I think you didn't end up answering the question. Yeah, go ahead.
I do want to expand on that. You know, in the same way that we talk about Ephesians 5, how the community of faith has been given to draw us through primarily to God, I need to say this very clearly. Like, your community of faith can't help you carry every pain. They just can't. There are some pains.
Can you say that one more time? Because I think we lost you a little bit there. Say that one more time.
Yeah. Your community of faith can't help you carry every pain. They just can't. They're not equipped for it.
Mm-hmm.
When we start thinking about things, particularly pain points like abuse, and even loss, especially in the pandemic, like some of the ways that people are dying, like it bends the imagination of how would you even deal with that, right? There are very, very good people who have been equipped to handle this. They're called therapists, psychiatrists, people who understand the ways the brain works and can examine whether you have a chemical imbalance. And then just therapists who can help you carry the weight and give you new ways to take your pain and to deal with your pain. You can use a Christian therapist who will help you figure out how to take that through primary attachment to God. You can go to a non-Christian therapist who will still give you good models, and just understand that those models are still given to us by God to help us deal with pain and carry our pain through to Him. And I was kind of doing a version of this seminar, and I was doing it at a church. It was a pastor's conference, and there was a theologian there that evidently was kind of a big deal. And he kind of picked a fight with me, and probably should have. It helped really refine my thinking on some of this. But he said, "Are you just saying this is all psychology?" And I remembered back to this quote by this famous quote by this kind of what my son calls Gandalf with a beard. He's this guitar playing worship leader in these sort of weird monkish circles. And one time somebody asked him, like, is all this mumbo jumbo about God just psychology? And he responded very quickly, did God not give me psychology? And I thought that was such a beautiful answer. This is the answer I gave to this theologian who I don't think really appreciated it. But it was very helpful for me to talk that out with him later, because what we came down to was like, listen, some of this stuff is actually psychology, and theologians are not actually equipped necessarily to deal with theology. And lawyers and writers are definitely not equipped to deal with theology or psychology. And so find a good therapist and some of these things that can help you deal with that pain. I think that's really important and sort of needs to be said.
Yeah, and I appreciate so much you kind of closing on that our community of faith, God has us positioned to play a role in each other's lives, right? As well as going outside of that in some specific things of needing specific help, like you said, as far as a therapist or whatever. And I'm very thankful, and Dave, I know you would agree that the Lord has positioned the chapel. Some churches, some communities, they don't have immediate resources to even find out, how do I land there? How do I even assess, is this something that I need? Can I partner with a person within the church to kind of walk through this with, or do I need a therapist? Like what level am I at? And so I just want to, before we close, just make sure that we let everyone know, if you're resonating with a lot of what Seth has shared, and you're in need of any of the things that he's kind of talked about, please reach out. The website, our website, I can't even talk. I need some of that tea, Seth. I need to get some of that. Anyway, care@thechapel.org. reach out. We definitely want to be able to provide resources for you, as well as some, maybe identify with some of the care ministries that we have here at the chapel. So just wanted to make sure we put that out there as well.
Yeah, thank you, Jamie. And with that, I'm gonna draw the seminar portion to a close. We do have one kind of final tag we want to put on the end of tonight, but man, Seth, just on behalf of us at the chapel and the broader group of people that are with us tonight, we just want to say a huge thank you to you for being with us. The only thing better would have been having you here in person, but we'll take it. We'll take this as a second best. And it's been a great day. We want to thank you for having the discipline to put your wisdom and your passion in the form of books. And I just want to remind all of you, I got my copies right here. This is Seth's 2 books, Coming Clean and the book of Waking Up. Really, really excellent. I recommend them. Chapel has nothing to gain by that endorsement, because you just go to Amazon and get them yourself. But this has been really helpful. And I think more than anything, I just so appreciate you rooting everything in our faith in Christ as being the overarching relationship that dictates everything. So thank you for that. And with that, Jamie, can you just kind of introduce us to this last 5-minute segment?
Yeah, sure. And I don't even think it's going to be 5 minutes. We asked the 2 really main facilitators of our addiction care ministry, it's called More Than Conquerors, MTC, to just kind of extend an invitation for those that may really feel compelled to even just find out more. And so if you want to hang out for just a couple more minutes, I also want to mention that in addition to the addiction care ministry, we also are going to be starting Friends and Family, which really are for those that are walking alongside someone who has identified themselves and understanding that they're in addiction, or even someone who is living and, again, walking in life with someone who hasn't recognized that. That can be very isolating. That can be devastating. And so anyway, so this next couple of minutes will introduce you to our 2 amazing leaders for MTC that are willing to just walk alongside those who need that support. We'll hand it over to them.
Hi, I'm Janet Tancredi.
And I'm Bobby Centino, and we're both facilitators for the More Than Conquerors group here at the chapel. And we just wanted to let people know that we are here and that we're offering up this ministry to anybody who suffers from addiction. We cover pretty much every addiction, anything that brings us away from God. I just want to let you know about myself. I've suffered from addiction for a long period of my life and completely changed around and recovered and probably, I'd like to say, a success story from where I came from.
I also have struggled with addiction, and I understand that the solution for me has always come from the Lord. And so I'm proud to be part of More Than Conquerors, and I encourage anybody who is struggling or who has a family member who is struggling or a loved one that's struggling to get in touch with us. We'd be more than happy to sit down and talk to you, and we would encourage you to come to our meetings and just see how they are.
We want to let you know we have 2 meetings a week. We have one meeting Wednesday at 7 p.m. and we also have an online meeting at Saturday at 9 a.m. If anybody's interested in joining our meeting or coming to see us or to find out some more information, you can reach out to thecare@thechapel.org and you can find out whatever you need to know. We want to also let you know that it is all anonymous, so everybody that comes there, it kind of stays in that meeting. I think that's very important, so that everybody can feel comfortable with what they share and everything else.
We all know that our addictions grow in our isolation, and the sooner that we can get out and we can be with people and we can be sharing our stories and we can hear about the solution that we find through the Lord, the better our life will become.